General Hospital spoilers for reveal that Drew had always known how to play the long game. Ever since the moment Michael was awarded sole custody of Wiley and Amelia. Drew had felt the walls closing in, not just around Willow, but around his own carefully crafted illusion of control. He watched as the family he had tried to weave together unraveled before his eyes. And for the first time since returning to Port Charles, he realized just how fragile everything truly was. But fragility could be manipulated. And if Drew had learned anything from his years of fighting for relevance, it was that desperate men don't wait, they act. His decision to marry Willow wasn't born out of love. It wasn't even born out of sympathy for the woman who was clearly unraveling beneath the weight of her grief. It was born out of calculation. Drew saw the chaos in Willow as something useful. Something moldable. Her psychological collapse was a door left ajar, and he stepped through it with the quiet cunning of a man who had spent too many years living in the shadow of others, of Michael. Of Jason, of everyone who had ever been more than he was. The wedding came quickly, almost too quickly for anyone to make sense of it. Just days after her collapse in court. Drew convinced Willow that marrying him was the only way she could fight back. He had already laid the groundwork, subtly twisting Martin's advice into a narrative that made him look like her savior. "This is the only way to show the court stability," he whispered. "They need to see a strong, two-parent home. They need to see that you're not alone." But she was alone, and Drew knew that. He had isolated her perfectly, pulling her away from Sasha, from Carly, from even the faintest hope of reconciliation with Michael. With each signature, each vow rehearsed in haste, Willow became less herself and more a pawn in Drew's increasingly warped pursuit of redemption through domination. By the time the wedding day arrived, the tension in Port Charles had already reached a boiling point. Carly sensed it. So did Sonny. Even Sasha, who had tried to believe Drew's motives were pure, began to see through the cracks. But it was too late. The ceremony was held in private, with only a handful of witnesses, no grand fanfare, no quartermain celebration. Just a quiet, tightly controlled event where Drew's smile never quite reached his eyes and Willow's trembling hands clutched the bouquet like it might anchor her to something real. As the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Drew exhaled slowly. He had done it. He now had a legal hold not just over Willow, but over her claim to Wiley and Amelia. The paperwork he had so carefully prepared weeks earlier, hidden from even Willow herself, was activated the moment she said, "I do." The ink on the marriage license was still wet when Drew made his next move. With quiet precision, he filed a petition to revisit custody, using his marriage to Willow as new evidence of stability. He framed himself not as an opportunist, but as a protector, a man willing to stand beside his broken wife in her time of need. The court took notice. So did Michael. And just like that, what had been a personal tragedy for Willow transformed into a war between two men, each claiming to know what was best for her children. Drew spun his narrative masterfully. He cited Willow's fragile mental state, her hospitalization, the unpredictable spiral she had fallen into. But he never took blame. Instead, he positioned himself as the only constant. The only stable figure in a storm of chaos. Behind closed doors, however, the truth was far more sinister. Drew wasn't trying to save Willow, he was trying to weaponize her. He pushed her to appear more broken in public, discouraging her from therapy, isolating her from support systems, subtly reinforcing her need to depend solely on him. The more dependent she became, the stronger his legal standing. Every breakdown became a piece of evidence. Every panic attack, a strategic advantage. What Drew didn't account for was how deeply damaged Willow would become. Her dissociation deepened. She began to lose track of time, wandering through the Quartermain mansion in a daze, unable to distinguish days from nights. Drew chalked it up to trauma. But others began to whisper. Carly started digging. Sasha noticed the bruises on Willow's wrists, subtle pressure marks from being grabbed too tightly during one of Drew's corrections. Michael, still reeling from the betrayal, began to suspect something darker. As the town watched in horror, a new theory began to emerge. that Drew had planned everything from the start. That he had preyed on Willow's vulnerability after the custody ruling. That he had gaslit her into believing she was the problem. That he had used her grief to orchestrate the perfect legal storm. And as rumors swirled, Drew only tightened his grip. He filed motions for joint custody with increasing aggression. Petitioning to restrict Michael's access to the children until Willow's recovery could be guaranteed. In court, he painted a portrait of himself as a man burdened by love. Trapped in a nightmare of his wife's unraveling, but determined to hold the family together for the children's sake. It was compelling. It was rehearsed. And it was entirely false. But Drew didn't care about truth anymore. He cared about victory. He had already lost too much, his career, his brother, his dignity. He would not lose this. And so, as Willow faded further into psychological fog, Drew forged ahead, confident that no one could stop him. But behind the scenes, the tide was turning. Carly confronted Sasha with her suspicions. Sasha revealed the recordings she had begun making, audio proof of Drew's emotional manipulation, his veiled threats, his admissions of legal strategy. Michael, driven by rage and desperation, filed an emergency motion to reopen custody, citing psychological abuse. The court hesitated. After all, Drew had the marriage certificate. He had the optics. But optics are fragile. The story Drew had spun began to unravel when Willow, during a rare moment of lucidity, whispered a single sentence to a nurse at General Hospital. "He made me sign it." The statement triggered an internal review. Martin, once Drew's quiet advisor, was subpoenaed. Under oath, he cracked. The paperwork Willow had signed months ago, documents she never read, had transferred temporary guardianship of Wiley and Amelia to Drew in the event of her hospitalization. And Drew had filed those documents 2 days before Willow's courtroom breakdown. Suddenly, what had looked like coincidence became a roadmap. A plan. An attack. The court ruled for an emergency hearing. Drew was ordered to present all communication between him and Martin, as well as any medical records or therapy logs regarding Willow. Carly submitted Sasha's recordings. Michael brought in Willow's medical team. And slowly, methodically, the empire Drew had built began to collapse. He watched as Michael took Willow's hand in the courtroom, as Sasha testified through tears, as Carly refused to look away. He watched everything crumble. And still, he did not blink. Because in his mind, Drew had already won. He had forced them all to see him, not as a shadow, not as a mistake, but as a man who could bend the system to his will. He had broken Willow not with fists, but with fear. He had made Michael bleed without lifting a weapon. In the end, Drew was removed from the estate. Willow was placed in inpatient care. Michael regained custody. But the scars remained, on the town, on the children, and most of all, on Willow herself. Because some victories come in silence. And Drew Kane had taught them all how quietly monsters can win. Would you like this story continued, or want a follow-up focused on Sasha, Carly, or the courtroom aftermath? Drew had crossed the threshold from desperation into madness. And now every move he made reeked of obsession masked as strategy. He no longer viewed Willow as a woman he once claimed to love or protect. She was now nothing more than a means to an end. A vessel through which he could unravel Michael piece by piece. The custody war had already pushed him to extreme lengths. But what was unfolding now, his manipulation of Willow to destroy not just Michael's sanity but the life of an innocent child like Daisy, was proof that Drew had truly descended into a place from which there was no return. He had spent weeks slowly isolating Willow, convincing her that Michael was the enemy, that he had stolen her children, ruined her life, and abandoned her in her most vulnerable state. And Willow, emotionally shattered and reeling from her mental breakdown, could no longer distinguish Drew's lies from truth. Drew's plan was chillingly calculated. He wanted Willow to petition the court to not only remove Michael's parental rights over Wiley and Amelia, but to launch a formal inquiry into Michael's fitness to raise Daisy as well. He planted seeds in Willow's fragile mind, fabricated concerns about Daisy's safety, suggested that Michael was distracted, negligent, even dangerous. He encouraged Willow to claim she had witnessed moments of emotional instability in Michael, moments that never happened. He wrote entire narratives for her, scripts of false memories and confessions, and coached her through them until she recited them as though they were her own truth. Willow's mind, splintered by trauma and guilt, struggled to resist, but Drew's grip was suffocating. Behind closed doors, he began working with contacts to gather falsified documentation, medical records, school reports, anything that could be twisted into evidence against Michael. And when that wasn't enough, he turned his gaze to Daisy. It wasn't just about removing Michael from her life, it was about erasing Daisy from the Quartermain legacy altogether. Drew began to spread rumors that Daisy wasn't Michael's biological daughter, hinting that she was the result of an affair. A child of uncertain paternity who had no rightful place in the Corinthos or Quartermain lines. The implications were devastating. Drew knew exactly what he was doing. He was trying to erase Michael's family piece by piece, using Willow as both a sword and a shield. But it didn't stop there. In the shadows, Drew was also making calls to legal officials, pressuring judges, attempting to bribe court-appointed child advocates to recommend supervised visitation or even temporary removal of Daisy from Michael's custody. He used Willow's name in official documents, filed petitions with her forged signature, and when she questioned it, he gaslit her into believing she had agreed to everything. And while all of this unfolded, he kept Willow in a fog of sedatives and paranoia, pushing her further into emotional chaos while parading her in court as a fragile mother regaining her strength. His obsession with domination grew bolder. Drew started monitoring Michael's home, tracking his movements, and even used Willow's access to the Quartermain estate to install surveillance, hidden cameras, microphones, anything that could be twisted into compromising material. He viewed it as a war. And in this war, Daisy was collateral damage. His plan was not only to destroy Michael's reputation and strip him of his children, but to publicly disgrace him by suggesting he had manipulated Daisy's identity for power and sympathy. Carly and Sasha began noticing the cracks. Willow's behavior became erratic, she spoke in fragments, forgot appointments, became terrified of sunlight and shadows. One night, she confided in Sasha that she wasn't sure what was real anymore. Drew says Michael is dangerous, that Daisy isn't his daughter, but I don't remember any of it. I feel like I'm disappearing. Sasha immediately realized something was terribly wrong. She confided in Carly, and the two women began digging into court filings and medical reports. What they uncovered was horrifying: forged signatures, altered reports, and a custody petition that made Willow appear as the sole petitioner against Michael, when she hadn't even been lucid for days. The final straw came when a court clerk anonymously leaked a recorded phone call in which Drew could be heard orchestrating a smear campaign against Michael, and using Willow's medical history as leverage. The backlash was immediate. A judge called an emergency hearing, and Drew was subpoenaed for fraud, coercion, and falsifying court documents. Willow, brought into the courtroom under protective care, broke down on the stand. With trembling hands and vacant eyes, she whispered the truth: "He told me Michael was going to hurt Daisy. But I never saw it. I never believed it. I didn't know what to believe anymore." The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Drew sat motionless as the truth of his depravity echoed across the chamber. His plan, so carefully constructed, so brilliantly orchestrated, was disintegrating. Michael rose slowly from his seat, walking to Willow, taking her hand not out of love, but out of pain. She had been used, shattered, reprogrammed. And yet, in that moment, her truth was the first piece of healing. The judge stripped Drew of all custody petitions, issued a restraining order, and ordered a full psychological evaluation. As he was escorted out of the courtroom in handcuffs, he didn't resist. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He only looked at Willow, a shadow of the woman he had broken, and whispered, "I was only trying to make you see." But she had seen. And now the whole world had too. Would you like to continue this storyline into the next phase, where Willow recovers, or perhaps where Drew retaliates from behind bars? What had once been a custody dispute grounded in legal precedent and emotional uncertainty had now evolved into a full-blown descent into chaos. The quiet hum of family court proceedings. Whispers in hallways, and exchanged affidavits gave way to a storm of psychological warfare, clandestine maneuvering, and a darkness that infected everything it touched. Drew, whose motivations had once seemed rooted in protection and loyalty, had become a man consumed not just by vengeance but by obsession, believing that his version of control was justice. That his role in Willow's life was ordained, unshakable, and absolute. And Willow, no longer tethered by reason, drifted further into a world shaped by trauma and delusion. The bond that tied them, once frayed and forged by grief, was now something else entirely, dangerous, manipulative, and utterly disassociated from reality. Drew's decision to marry Willow had not been the result of love or mutual healing. It had been a strategy, a deeply layered, calculated attempt to bind Willow to him through the law. And through her own need for reassurance. He had watched her break under the weight of losing her children, seen her stare into the void after the judge ruled in Michael's favor. And instead of guiding her toward recovery, he had offered her a lifeline made of illusions. He presented marriage as the solution, insisting it would help strengthen her claim in the eyes of the court, while privately knowing it would cement his own power over her and any decisions made regarding the children. The ceremony itself had been small, rushed, and devoid of true celebration. Behind the smiles captured in photos lay a chilling silence. A shared understanding between bride and groom that this was no union of hearts, but a weapon. Once married, Drew wasted no time moving to file motions that would cast doubt on Michael's custody rights. He reintroduced old hospital records, alleging that Michael had been mentally unstable after his return from Europe. He pushed stories of Sasha's past addiction back into the public eye, reawakening wounds she had spent years burying. He even released fabricated recordings, audio clips doctored to suggest that Sasha had yelled at Wiley or left Amelia alone near the pool. In private, he urged Willow to write a personal statement to the judge, filled with half-truths and buried rage. She complied, writing with trembling hands but unwavering belief that she was finally reclaiming what was hers. But as Drew tightened his grip on the situation, the fallout became increasingly violent. Wiley began withdrawing. He refused to eat at school. He trembled when asked about home visits. He avoided eye contact with Drew and became visibly distressed when Willow entered the room. His drawings, once colorful depictions of his family, now showed faceless figures, dark shadows with red eyes, hovering over a crying boy. Amelia began wetting the bed, waking from nightmares, crying for Sasha in the middle of the night even when she was just downstairs. Michael, whose patience had been shredded by months of conflict, finally took action and demanded an independent child advocate be assigned. The advocate's report was devastating. It painted a picture of a household ruled by fear, control, and silence. The children were terrified, not by overt violence, but by emotional manipulation so insidious they couldn't articulate it. Drew responded by blaming Michael for planting the story. He accused the advocate of bias. He threatened to file lawsuits against the child psychologist, the school counselor, and even the judge. His behavior grew erratic, pacing during court sessions, snapping at lawyers, and showing up unannounced at Michael's home. Meanwhile, Willow had withdrawn completely from everyone but Drew. She stopped visiting her friends. She stopped attending therapy. She began writing in a journal obsessively, pages upon pages filled with repeated phrases, the ink bleeding through the paper. I am their mother. I am their mother. I am their mother. Her presence at court became a ghost-like apparition. Silent. Pale. Haunted. Then came the tipping point. Sasha, overwhelmed with grief and fear, discovered that her medical records had been accessed illegally. Someone had tried to have her involuntarily committed by submitting forged documents claiming she had relapsed. The hospital launched an internal investigation and traced the digital breach back to an IP address registered to Drew's assistant. The discovery didn't just unravel the legal case, it shattered the thin veil Drew had constructed around his intentions. Carly, who had remained mostly silent through the ordeal, stepped in with Jason to confront the mounting evidence. Jason, ever the silent protector, collected security footage, affidavits, and records that proved Drew had been following Michael, recording his calls, and even bribing a former nanny to testify against Sasha. The court ordered an emergency protective ruling, granting Michael full temporary custody and forbidding Drew and Willow from contacting the children without court-approved supervision. But the damage had already seeped into every corner of their lives. Willow, faced with the collapse of her carefully constructed world, spiraled. She refused food. She stopped speaking. One night, Drew found her standing in the nursery with Amelia's old onesie pressed to her face, whispering lullabies to a crib that hadn't been used in weeks. When he tried to pull her away, she bit him. It was then he realized, control was slipping. The woman he had molded into a perfect weapon had broken. And she was not going to be pieced back together again. That same week, Wiley went missing. Michael had turned his back for only a moment at the park, answering a call from Diane. When he turned around, his son was gone. Panic ripped through Port Charles. Amber alerts. Police cruisers. Helicopters. For 6 hours, there was no trace of the boy. And then, a neighbor reported seeing Willow near the park earlier that day, wearing a hoodie and pacing near the edge of the playground. Jason was the one who found her. Deep in the woods outside the Quartermain estate, she sat against a tree with Wiley asleep in her lap, humming the same lullaby from the nursery. She didn't resist arrest. She didn't cry. She just stared blankly at Jason and asked, "Can I go now? They don't need me anymore." Willow was placed under psychiatric care. Drew was arrested pending charges of obstruction, fraud, and conspiracy. Sasha collapsed from exhaustion and grief. And Michael, left holding both of his traumatized children in his arms, stood in the ruins of what had once been a hopeful family life, now scorched by manipulation, vengeance, and madness. Would you like the story to continue into what happens when Willow returns from treatment, or how Drew might retaliate from prison?